Imagine being trapped at -60 degrees Celsius with nothing but a collapsing cabin between you and death. No fire, no food, no way to call for help. This is the true story of survival against impossible odds, where one man discovers that sometimes the greatest discoveries come from the darkest moments. If you're enjoying this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel. The wind screamed like something alive, clawing at every surface it could find. Marcus Webb pressed his back against the cabin wall, his breath forming crystalline clouds that froze before they could dissipate into the darkness. Outside, the blizzard had transformed the world into a white void, a landscape so hostile that even looking through the broken window felt dangerous. He'd been hiking the Beartooth Mountains for 3 days when the weather turned. The forecast had promised clear skies and mild temperatures for early spring in Montana. Weather forecasts, he'd learned, were written by people who'd never actually stood on a mountainside, watching their own mortality crystallize in the air. Marcus was a geologist, accustomed to harsh conditions. He'd worked in Iceland, Patagonia, and the Canadian Arctic. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. The thermometer on his wristwatch had stopped working hours ago at -58 degrees. He could only assume it had gotten worse, much worse. 3 hours earlier, when the storm had transformed from snow to something almost solid, Marcus had abandoned any thought of reaching the valley settlement before nightfall. His original plan, a 6-day hiking expedition to study glacial formations, had seemed reasonable when he'd left his hotel in Red Lodge, Montana. The Weather Service had issued no warnings. The conditions had seemed manageable for an experienced mountaineer. But weather in the Beartooths was deceptive. The mountains created their own systems, their own rules. They could transform in minutes from inviting to lethal. Marcus had been navigating by memory and his GPS device when the device had died. The batteries, drained by the cold, had simply stopped providing power. With visibility reduced to perhaps 5 meters and no clear landmarks visible through the whiteout, Marcus had made the decision that likely saved his life. He would seek shelter and wait for the storm to pass. The cabin had appeared like a miracle through the white curtain of snow. Ancient and weathered, its wooden walls had absorbed decades of mountain weather. The door hung partially open, as if inviting him inside, though the invitation came from abandonment rather than welcome. Marcus had pushed through without hesitation, knowing that staying outside for even 10 more minutes would mean frostbite, then hypothermia, then nothing. Now, huddled in the corner of what appeared to be the main room, Marcus took inventory of his situation with the systematic thinking of a trained scientist. His hiking pack contained 3 energy bars, a water bottle, a first aid kit, and a thermal blanket designed for emergency situations. The blanket would help, but it wasn't enough. Not for a night like this, possibly not for multiple nights. The cabin itself offered minimal comfort. The wooden floor was rotted in places, exposing gaps to the frigid air beneath. A stone fireplace stood against the far wall, its chimney disappearing into the darkness above. Empty shelves lined the walls, and a single cot with a torn mattress occupied the corner opposite Marcus. Whoever had lived here had abandoned it long ago, taking everything of value with them. The structure groaned under the assault of wind. Marcus studied the ceiling, noting several places where snow had begun to accumulate above small gaps in the roof. If the storm continued for several more days, the weight alone could collapse the cabin. He forced down the panic that thought generated. Marcus forced himself to move. Staying still meant death. He needed to find wood, create insulation, do anything to generate warmth. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was an active killer, draining body heat, slowing thoughts, transforming rational decision-making into confusion. He'd read about it in textbooks during his university years. Now he was experiencing it firsthand. He began exploring the cabin systematically, his fingers already numb despite wearing thermal gloves. The main room measured perhaps 4 by 5 meters. A wooden table and 2 chairs, both sturdy despite their age, occupied the center. The chairs were solid wood, not ideal for burning, but they would provide fuel if necessary. Behind the main room, he discovered a smaller kitchen area. The stove was ancient cast iron, rusted but intact. Beneath a collapsed shelf, he found fragments of newspaper from 1987, confirmation that this place had been abandoned for nearly 4 decades. In a corner, miraculously, someone had left a small stack of old wooden furniture, a broken chair, part of a table, and what looked like cabinet doors. The wood was dry, having been sheltered from weather for years. Marcus carried the wood pieces to the fireplace, making multiple trips despite his exhaustion. His mind was already calculating, if he could create a fire, he could generate heat. Heat meant survival. The cabin suddenly seemed less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. He needed kindling. Paper could serve that purpose, the old newspaper fragments from the kitchen, but he had nothing obvious to start the fire. His lighter was in his pack, but he needed tinder that would catch quickly. Then Marcus remembered his backpack. His emergency supplies included a small knife and a waterproof fire starter, a small container of materials specifically designed to ignite even in damp conditions. He could use strips of newspaper as tinder, the dry wood as fuel. 20 minutes later, after several false starts and moments of fear that the fire wouldn't catch, smoke began rising from the fireplace. The chimney drew well despite its age, suggesting that whoever had built this cabin had understood the principles of ventilation and smoke management. The first flames appeared tentatively, almost apologetically. Then they grew bolder, spreading across the dry wood, creating actual heat that Marcus could feel even from several meters away. Marcus sat before the fire, eating one of his energy bars slowly, rationing it despite his hunger. Each bite was precious. His body was burning calories rapidly in this cold, but he needed to be strategic. If he was trapped here for days, he needed the food to last. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and for the first time since the blizzard began, Marcus allowed himself to believe he might survive the night. He wrapped himself in his thermal blanket and sat before the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind assault the cabin walls. Somewhere beyond the white curtain, rescue teams might be mobilizing, or they might not if no one knew he was missing. He'd left vague information about his destination, mentioning only that he was hiking in Montana. As darkness deepened and the fire burned steadily, Marcus forced himself to focus on practical concerns. Tomorrow, if the storm continued, he would need to maintain the fire, find food or ways to preserve body heat, and explore the cabin more thoroughly. But tonight, he had heat and shelter. It was more than many people had in their darkest moments. Outside, the wind continued its assault, but inside, there was heat, there was light, there was hope. If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me continue bringing you these incredible survival tales. The fire had burned down to embers by the time Marcus's curiosity drove him deeper into the cabin. He'd managed to rest for a few hours, wedged between the fireplace and the cot, his thermal blanket wrapped around him like a cocoon. Sleep had been fragmented, interrupted by the wind and his own racing mind, but it was better than the alternative, freezing to death while conscious. Around what he estimated to be 3 in the morning, Marcus had awakened to a terrifying sound, the wind changing direction. Instead of the steady assault from one direction, it began shifting, finding new gaps in the cabin structure. Through a crack in the wall, snow had begun to accumulate on the interior floor. Marcus had frantically stuffed cloth and old newspaper into the gaps, buying a few more hours of relative peace. As the pale grey light of dawn began to filter through the windows, though the blizzard made it nearly impossible to distinguish day from night, Marcus decided to thoroughly explore his temporary shelter. Understanding the cabin's resources might mean the difference between survival and tragedy. Every detail mattered now. He started with the loft. A wooden ladder, surprisingly sturdy despite its age, led upward into shadows. Marcus climbed carefully, testing each rung before committing his weight, acutely aware that a fall or injury out here could be fatal. The loft was small, barely large enough to stand upright, and initially appeared empty. Dust particles danced in the thin light, filtering through a gap in the roof, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the darkness. But as Marcus's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he noticed something unusual. In the far corner, someone had stacked flat objects beneath a deteriorating tarp. His heart quickened. With trembling fingers, trembling from cold and adrenaline, he pulled back the tarp and discovered journals. There were 7 of them, leather-bound volumes that had been preserved somehow in this isolated place. The handwriting on the first page was precise and deliberate, the script of someone who'd valued order and documentation. Mountain Cabin Log. James H. Morrison, 1954. Marcus sat on the dusty floor, his back against the wooden frame of the loft, and began reading. The first entries were practical, descriptions of the cabin's construction, details about roofing materials, notes about the foundation. But as Marcus read deeper, the journals transformed into something more profound, a complete record of one man's decision to abandon civilization and embrace the mountains. James H. Morrison, the entries revealed, had been a structural engineer from Denver. At 52 years old, with a successful career and a failed marriage behind him, he'd made a decision that most people would consider insane. He would leave everything and build a cabin in the Beartooth Mountains. He would live off the land, study the wilderness, and document everything he learned. The early entries were filled with doubt. Morrison had written about the crushing loneliness of the first winter, about the constant struggle against cold and hunger, about nights when he seriously considered abandoning the experiment and returning to civilization. But gradually, something shifted in the tone of the journals. Doubt transformed into determination, then into something deeper, a genuine love for this harsh landscape and the knowledge he was gaining about how to survive within it. But it was Morrison's practical knowledge that captivated Marcus. The journals were filled with detailed survival techniques specific to the mountains. Morrison described how to preserve food through the brutal winters using combinations of smoking, salting, and root cellars. He detailed which plants were edible and when they should be harvested. He provided extensive notes about treating injuries with available resources, how to create poultices from certain plants, how to recognize signs of infection, how to set broken bones using materials at hand. Morrison had even sketched diagrams of the cabin's structure, noting weak points and how he'd reinforced them over the years. He'd provided detailed descriptions of the chimney system and discovered that the fireplace could burn for many hours on minimal wood if properly managed. The old engineer had studied the draft, the way smoke moved through the chimney, and had made subtle adjustments to maximize efficiency. One entry, dated in March 1962, contained information that made Marcus's breath catch. Morrison had documented the location of a storage cellar beneath the cabin's eastern wall, buried and insulated with dirt and stone. He'd written that he was storing preserved foods there before his final winter, suggesting that this entry marked the beginning of the end of Morrison's time in the mountains. The final entries, scattered across multiple journals and spanning several years, became increasingly philosophical. Morrison seemed to be summing up his life's experience, passing on knowledge to whoever might find his cabin. His last entry, dated May 15, 1975, was brief but profound. "I am old now, and the mountains are calling me to rest. But I leave this place as I found it, as a teacher. If you read these words, you understand what these mountains demand and what they offer. The cold is honest, the hunger teaches discipline, the solitude reveals truth. Live here with respect, and you will find that you are more than you ever imagined." James H. Morrison. Marcus sat in silence for a long time after reading that final entry. Tears froze on his cheeks in the cold air of the loft. Somehow, across decades, a man he'd never met had left him a message precisely when he needed it most. He returned downstairs, his mind racing with possibilities. If Morrison had documented the location of a storage cellar, and if that cellar had been properly insulated, there was a possibility, however remote, that supplies might still be preserved there. Marcus began searching the eastern wall of the cabin systematically. He knocked on the wooden floor, listening for the hollow sound that might indicate a hidden compartment. Nothing. He examined the stone foundation, visible through gaps in the rotting floorboards. Nothing. Then he noticed something, a wooden trapdoor, carefully hidden beneath a pile of debris in the corner. The wood was stained dark with age, nearly invisible among the other refuse. Morrison had mentioned this in one of the later journals, a trapdoor that accessed a storage area beneath the cabin. Marcus cleared away the debris and pulled the handle. The door resisted at first, swollen by moisture and decades of disuse, but eventually gave way. Beneath it was a wooden ladder leading into darkness. Marcus grabbed a burning branch from the fire and descended carefully, aware that the structure might be unstable. The cellar was small, perhaps 3 meters square, with concrete floor and stone walls. Despite nearly 40 years of abandonment, the temperature was noticeably stable, warmer than the cabin above, suggesting that Morrison had been correct about the insulating properties of the earth. The shelves that Morrison had mentioned were there, though empty of food. Whatever Morrison had stored had long since spoiled or been claimed by animals. But the walls bore his legacy. Using charcoal or burnt wood, Morrison had carved instructions directly into the stone. How to smoke and preserve meat, how to identify edible roots, how to construct traps for animals. The cellar was a classroom left behind by a devoted teacher. Marcus returned to the cabin's main room, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He had supplies, his energy bars, his water, the fish he might catch if he could figure out how. But more than that, he had knowledge. Morrison had documented decades of survival experience, passed it on through these journals, left it encoded in the very structure of the cabin. As Marcus settled before the fire that evening, the journals stacked beside him, something shifted fundamentally in his mind. He was no longer a stranded hiker hoping for rescue. He was no longer a desperate man trying to survive until help arrived. He was a student, and the mountains had provided him with a teacher. The blizzard, which had seemed like death, had instead become an opportunity for learning. If you're still following this incredible journey, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to see what happens next. Your support helps bring more stories like this to the channel. By the 4th day, the blizzard had finally stopped. The world outside the cabin was transformed into an alien landscape of pristine white, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The temperature had risen slightly, to minus 40 degrees Celsius, but Marcus understood that this was still lethal if he wasn't careful. The wind had diminished to occasional gusts, and for the first time since seeking shelter, Marcus could see the sun, a pale disk suspended in a clear blue sky. He'd spent the previous 3 days systematically studying Morrison's journals, not just reading them, but truly absorbing their lessons. He'd organized his time carefully, 2 hours of study, 2 hours of physical activity to maintain circulation and prevent atrophy, 2 hours of rest. He'd managed to keep the fire burning throughout, rationing the cabin's wooden components strategically, always holding back reserves in case the weather worsened again. One section of the journals had particularly struck Marcus. Morrison had written in an entry from 1968, "The mountain is not cruel, and it is not kind. It simply is. Respect it, learn its patterns, and it will teach you how to live within it. Fight it, and it will destroy you. The key is observation. Every detail matters. The way snow drifts in certain directions tells you where the wind comes from. The patterns of animal tracks reveal highways and habits. The behavior of plants indicates which foods are available and when. The mountain is constantly communicating. Most people simply refused to listen. Marcus applied this principle immediately. Instead of viewing the cabin as a prison, he began to view it as his base of operations, a headquarters from which to learn and plan. He documented the wind patterns, noticing that it primarily blew from the northwest and weakened slightly in the afternoons. He studied the sun's angle, even from its limited arc across the sky, and began to develop an intuitive sense of time and direction. He also studied the snow itself. Morrison had written extensively about snow composition, how it changed throughout the season, how different types indicated different weather patterns. The snow that had fallen during the blizzard was dense and heavy, weighted with moisture. But where the wind had swept it, creating cornices on the cabin's roof, it was transformed into crystalline ice, hard enough to support considerable weight. The snow that had drifted against the cabin's northern wall, creating a natural insulation barrier, gave Marcus an idea. Following Morrison's suggestions, he reinforced this barrier by packing additional snow into gaps and cracks, creating what Morrison called a snow wall, a protective barrier that would provide both insulation and wind protection. The cabin's temperature began to stabilize around 5 degrees Celsius during the day when the fire was burning, brutally cold by normal standards, but survivable with proper preparation. Food became Marcus's primary concern on the 5th day. His 3 energy bars were already history, consumed strategically over the first few days. But Morrison's journals contained detailed instructions for hunting and fishing, with specific guidance for spring conditions in the Beartooths. Morrison had written about the stream that flowed near the cabin, noting that it held trout and that ice fishing was possible in spring when the ice began to thin. The journal entries included sketches of fish traps, descriptions of the best times to fish, and notes about seasonal migrations. On the 5th day of being sheltered in the cabin, Marcus ventured outside for the first time since taking shelter. He moved carefully, testing each step, acutely aware of the avalanche risk. Morrison had warned extensively about the dangers of the slopes after heavy snow. The additional weight of the blizzard could make slopes unstable, potentially causing slides that would sweep down with lethal force. But the cabin sat in a relatively protected location, in a valley where the terrain was gentler and less prone to avalanches. Still, Marcus moved with extreme caution, probing the snow with a stick before committing his weight. Near the cabin, partially exposed by wind-carved snow formations, Marcus found the stream. It was partially frozen, the water visible in places where the ice had cracked or where the current was strong enough to prevent complete freezing. According to Morrison's notes, this stream held trout, and the ice would thin even more as spring advanced. Marcus spent the first hour simply observing the stream, learning its patterns. He noticed that where the water flowed faster, near certain rocks, the ice was thinner. He saw the faint shadows of fish moving beneath the ice in deeper pools. This was exactly what Morrison had described, the art of observation, of learning to read the landscape. He had no fishing line, but Morrison had described creating fishing equipment from available materials. Cotton thread from his own clothing, twisted and braided together, could serve as line. A small bone or metal fragment could be fashioned into a hook. For bait, Morrison had recommended using anything organic, insect larvae if available, bits of other fish, even plant material. That afternoon and evening, Marcus created his fishing rig. It was crude and primitive, but it was functional. The cotton thread, twisted into a reasonably strong cord, was tied to a small hook fashioned from a piece of the cabin's corroded metal roof. For bait, he used a small piece of one of his energy bars, reasoning that it contained organic material that fish might find attractive. His first attempt yielded nothing. Neither did his second or third. Marcus spent hours creating holes in the ice, waiting patiently, pulling up empty hooks with growing frustration. By the time darkness forced him to return to the cabin, he was beginning to doubt that his crude equipment would work. But Marcus remembered another principle from Morrison's journals: persistence. Morrison had written that success in wilderness survival required patience and willingness to learn from failure. Every failed attempt provided information about what didn't work, bringing you closer to what would work. The next morning, Marcus modified his approach. He created several fishing holes instead of focusing on one location. He used a piece of the cabin's interior wood, which he could see had been used for fuel in decades past, to fashion a more sophisticated hook. He created better bait by combining bits of dried plant matter with a paste made from some of his emergency rations. His fourth attempt, as the sun began its afternoon descent, finally succeeded. Marcus felt a tug at the line, unmistakable and thrilling. His heart thundered as he carefully pulled the line upward, conscious that too much force would break his makeshift equipment. A silver-finned trout, barely 8 inches long, emerged from the hole and into his trembling hands. It was a small catch, perhaps enough for a modest meal, maybe 2 if he supplemented it with other foraged items. But to Marcus it represented something far greater. Proof that Morrison's knowledge was practical, that he could survive using only what the mountains provided and what his mind could create. That evening, as he cleaned and cooked his catch over the fire, following Morrison's instructions for preparing fish with minimal tools, Marcus felt something shifting deep within him. The initial panic had faded, replaced by a growing sense of capability. He was no longer simply waiting for rescue. He was becoming part of this place. He began catching 2 to 3 fish daily after that first success. Each day, he improved his technique slightly, creating better hooks, improving his bait, learning to sense the subtle tugs that indicated fish activity. Morrison had written about how fishing became meditative after extended practice, how it taught patience and observation in equal measure. Marcus also foraged for plants, using Morrison's detailed sketches to identify edible species. Some plants were still dormant in the spring cold, but others were beginning to emerge. He found cattail roots near the stream, which Morrison had identified as nutritious and relatively easy to harvest by ice fishing through the frozen mud beneath the water. He discovered edible bark on certain willow trees. He found the emerging shoots of plants that would become full vegetables in summer. By the 10th day of being sheltered in the cabin, Marcus's situation had transformed from desperate to stable. He was catching adequate food, maintaining the fire, using Morrison's knowledge to stay healthy and warm. The immediate threat of death had receded, replaced by the more complex challenge of long-term survival. If this story is resonating with you, please leave a comment about what you think will happen next. I love hearing your thoughts. By the 10th day, Marcus's situation had stabilized into an almost routine existence. He was catching 2 to 3 fish daily, supplemented by edible plants he'd identified using Morrison's detailed sketches and descriptions. He'd managed to find several cans of food in a compartment Morrison had hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards. Beans and vegetables, their labels long faded, but the contents still preserved by the cold and the sealed containers. The first can he'd opened, he'd approached with extreme caution, aware that contaminated food could be worse than no food at all. But the contents appeared sound, sealed properly, and though the taste was slightly metallic and subdued after decades, the nutrition was real and substantial. The blizzard had become occasional snow squalls rather than a continuous assault. Temperatures fluctuated between -30 and -15 degrees Celsius, which Marcus now recognized as almost mild for the beartooths in late spring. He'd developed a physical routine that kept him healthy. Morning exercises to maintain circulation, afternoon fishing and foraging, evening food preparation and journal reading. But rescue hadn't come, and Marcus was beginning to suspect that no one was searching for him. He'd left minimal information about his hiking plans, something he deeply regretted now. His family in Colorado knew he was on a mountaineering expedition, but they didn't know his specific location. The mountain rescue teams didn't have coordinates. He'd mentioned to his hotel in Red Lodge that he might be back in 3 to 6 days, but that timeline had now passed considerably. To the world, Marcus Webb had simply vanished. This realization, rather than devastating him, sparked determination. If rescue wouldn't come to him, he would have to find his own way out. But not yet, not until he was completely prepared. Marcus had begun a daily routine of reading Morrison's journals methodically, absorbing not just the survival information, but also the philosophical underpinnings of long-term wilderness living. Morrison had written about the mental challenges of isolation, about maintaining purpose when no one else could witness your struggles, about finding meaning in simple daily tasks. One entry particularly struck Marcus. Morrison had written on what appeared to be the occasion of his 60th birthday, celebrated alone in the cabin. "Today, I am 60 years old. I have been in this cabin for 8 years. No one came to celebrate with me. No one knows where I am, and yet I feel richer than any man in the cities below. I have learned that survival is not about desperation or fear. It is about understanding the intricate relationship between yourself and the environment you inhabit. The mountains have taught me that I am not separate from nature, but part of it. This is worth more than all the wealth I left behind." Marcus found himself thinking about what his own life had been before the blizzard. He'd been successful by conventional standards, a respected geologist with publications in peer-reviewed journals, a comfortable salary, a nice apartment in Boulder, Colorado. And yet, underneath that success had been a persistent dissatisfaction. He'd been searching for something he couldn't quite name, which had driven him to increasingly remote research expeditions. Now, sitting in a cabin in the Montana wilderness, eating fish he'd caught himself, reading journals written by a man who'd achieved a kind of peace that Marcus had never experienced before, he found himself wondering if he'd been searching for this all along. Not the danger or the hardship, but the authenticity, the sense of being fully alive because every action had direct, immediate consequences. Morrison's journals contained one final section that Marcus had been studying intensely. The old engineer had documented the trails leading away from the cabin, marked routes that he'd used to reach the nearest town, a small settlement called Crystal Creek, approximately 15 miles northwest. The distance seemed impossible in Marcus's current state, but Morrison had written that it was achievable with proper preparation, even in winter or early spring conditions. The journals included detailed descriptions of landmarks along the route. Morrison had sketched maps with careful annotations. Large rock formation shaped like crow's head, used as direction marker. Grove of twisted pines, shelter available here. Stream junction, 3 directions, follow the westernmost stream. Avalanche zone, avoid during heavy snow or rain, go north and around. Most importantly, Morrison had written about the dangers specific to this route. He'd noted a particularly treacherous section where the trail crossed a valley prone to wind-sculpted snow formations. He'd warned about avalanche zones that became dangerous in spring as the snow began to thaw. He described the exact point where the terrain became less mountainous and more forested, indicating that civilization was close. Marcus began gathering supplies for his potential departure. He fashioned a backpack from cabin materials and an old blanket Morrison had left behind, carefully stitching it together using thread and needles he discovered in a small sewing kit in the cabin. He created a walking staff from a sturdy branch, hardened in the fire and shaped to be comfortable in his grip. He dried fish and foraged plants, storing them in containers he'd discovered in the cabin, small metal tins that had once held cooking materials. He studied the maps that Morrison had carefully drawn in the journal margins, maps that were crude but detailed, drawn by someone who'd walked these routes dozens of times over 40 years. Marcus created his own copies, memorizing landmarks and distances, rehearsing the route in his mind each evening before sleep. But first, Marcus understood, he needed to ensure that if rescue did come, rescuers would know he'd been there and where he was heading. Using charcoal from the fireplace, he wrote a large message on the cabin's roof, the letters visible from above. Webb, heading northwest, Crystal Creek. He also created a signal fire, stacking wood in a clearing visible from above. If a helicopter or plane passed over, the smoke from that fire might draw attention. But Marcus knew that relying on this was foolish. Rescue planes rarely ventured into the mountains during spring when weather was unpredictable, and the cabin was in a valley where visibility from above was limited. He had to trust in his own capability. Morrison had walked out of these mountains many times. So could he. On the 15th day of being sheltered in the cabin, Marcus prepared carefully for what might come next. He spent his morning fishing, catching enough dried fish to supplement his food supplies. He spent his afternoon creating additional warmth layers from cabin materials, insulating material that he could wear against his skin to help maintain body heat during his journey. He spent his evening reading Morrison's journals one final time, absorbing every detail, every warning, every piece of wisdom. As the fire burned low, Marcus performed an act that felt almost sacred. He carefully wrapped Morrison's journals in a waterproof cloth fashioned from oil and canvas materials he'd found in the cabin's storage area, placed them back in the loft, and protected them behind a small wooden barrier. These journals had saved his life. They deserved to survive, to continue helping others who might find this cabin. In the margins of the final journal, beside Morrison's last entry, Marcus wrote carefully in pencil, "James, your knowledge saved my life. Your wisdom taught me how to survive. Thank you for leaving behind your life's experience for strangers you would never meet." Marcus Webb, May 2024. That night, Marcus slept deeply for the first time since arriving at the cabin. Tomorrow, he would venture into the mountains, equipped with Morrison's knowledge and his own determination. The cabin had been a sanctuary, a place of learning and recovery, but it was also a place of transition. The time had come to move forward. If you're still following this incredible journey, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to see what happens next. This story is far from over. The trail away from the cabin was barely visible, obscured by drifting snow and the overgrowth of 15 years of abandonment since Morrison's last visit. But Morrison's descriptions, supplemented by Marcus's own careful observation during his time at the cabin, provided a reliable guide. The old engineer had been meticulous in his documentation, noting not just directions, but also the specific appearance of landmarks at different times of year. Marcus found the first landmark exactly where Morrison had described it. A distinctive rock formation, shaped roughly like a crow's head, protruding from the mountainside about 3 kilometers northwest of the cabin. The formation was partially obscured by snow, but its general shape was unmistakable. Morrison had written that this rock had been sacred to Native American tribes in the region centuries before, though no traces of that history remained visible now. The first 5 miles were deceptively manageable. The terrain sloped downward, and gravity assisted Marcus's progress. His makeshift boots, reinforced with extra cloth and animal hide he'd processed using Morrison's techniques, held firm against the uneven ground beneath the snow. The walking staff distributed his weight effectively, reducing strain on joints that had been compressed by cold and stress for over 2 weeks. But by late afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the jagged peaks to the west, Marcus realized that physical exertion at high altitude was far more demanding than he'd anticipated. His breathing grew labored. His legs felt leaden. The backpack, though not particularly heavy, perhaps 8 kilograms of supplies and equipment, seemed to increase in weight with each passing hour as his muscles fatigued. His heart rate remained elevated, pounding in his chest from exertion and from the adrenaline of finally being on his way. He'd spent over 2 weeks in the cabin, and his body had adapted to a relatively sedentary lifestyle. Now, Pushing through snow and climbing elevation changes, he was demanding far more from his physiology than it had become accustomed to. Around 3 in the afternoon, Marcus spotted the second landmark, a grove of pine trees twisted by decades of mountain wind patterns. The trees seemed to grow sideways rather than upward, their trunks bent into contorted shapes by the relentless wind coming down from the peaks. Morrison had written that this grove provided shelter, and Marcus could see why. The trees were dense enough that wind was significantly reduced within their embrace. He stopped at this grove and allowed himself rest. His heart gradually slowed its frantic pace. His breathing became less ragged. He ate some of his dried fish and a handful of foraged plant matter he'd been saving. The food, though simple, provided enough calories to recover some energy. As the sun continued its descent, Marcus realized that he wouldn't reach his planned stopping point before darkness fell. Morrison had mentioned a relatively protected spot about 7 kilometers from the cabin, a depression between 2 rocky outcroppings that provided shelter from wind. But Marcus could see that reaching it before night would be impossible. Instead, he used the last light to build a shelter within the grove of twisted pines. Following Morrison's instructions, he arranged branches and evergreen boughs to create a windbreak, packing snow around the base to seal gaps. He built a small fire using dead wood he'd gathered and stored in his pack and settled in for the night as darkness consumed the landscape. That night, huddled beneath his improvised shelter with fire crackling nearby, Marcus found himself experiencing an unexpected emotion. Gratitude, not just toward Morrison for the practical knowledge, but toward the mountain itself and toward his own capacity to endure. By surviving the initial crisis, by being forced to slow down and learn, he'd been given something precious: perspective. His life before the blizzard felt increasingly distant. The career anxieties, the relationship failures, the sense of purposelessness that had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains, all of it seemed trivial now. What mattered was the next step, the next breath, the next day. What mattered was the reality of immediate survival. The second day of travel proved more challenging than the first. The terrain became steeper and snow conditions worsened as Marcus descended into a valley. Morrison had warned extensively about this valley in his journals. It was prone to wind-sculpted snow formations that could shift unexpectedly, creating hazards for travelers. Marcus moved with extreme caution, testing each step before committing his full weight. He used his walking staff to probe ahead, checking for hidden crevasses or thin snow bridges that might collapse under his weight. The wind had created strange formations here, sharp ridges of snow called sastrugi that could cut exposed skin, and deep depressions that were invisible until you fell into them. Progress was slow. What should have been a manageable 8 kilometers in a day took nearly 10 hours of careful travel. But around midday, Marcus found the third landmark, a frozen stream junction where water flowed in 3 directions. Morrison had written extensively about this location, noting that the western stream led eventually down to Crystal Creek, while the northern stream was a dead end that descended into a canyon, and the eastern stream was too small to follow reliably. Around midday, just as Marcus was preparing to follow the western stream, disaster nearly struck. The snow beneath Marcus's left foot suddenly gave way. A hidden crevasse, disguised by the drifting snow, opened up suddenly beneath him. Marcus plunged downward, his walking staff jamming against the crevasse walls and arresting his fall after dropping only 6 feet into icy darkness. For a moment, Marcus hung suspended, his staff the only thing between him and a fall into unknown depths. His heart hammered in his chest so violently that he thought he might have a heart attack. The crevasse was narrow, barely wider than his body, and the walls were smooth ice. He had no way to climb out using his hands alone. Taking deep breaths, forcing himself to think clearly despite the panic, Marcus positioned his feet against the crevasse wall and pushed upward while pulling on his staff. The angle was awkward, but with tremendous effort, he managed to lever himself upward enough to grab the edge of the crevasse opening with his hands. The movement dislodged snow, which cascaded down into the crevasse. Marcus hauled himself fully onto solid snow, gasping, shaking uncontrollably. For nearly 30 minutes afterward, he simply sat on solid snow, hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through his system, acutely aware of how close he'd come to death. This was the mountain's reminder, he thought. Respect it, or it will destroy you. Marcus adjusted his route, moving away from the valley's center and staying on higher ground where the snow was more stable. Progress slowed considerably, but safety improved. By evening, he'd covered perhaps 8 miles total, a decent distance considering the terrain, but not the 10 he'd hoped for. Each night brought new challenges. The temperature dropped to dangerous levels, occasionally reaching -35°C. Marcus's body, weakened by 2 weeks of limited food and extreme conditions, followed by the exertion of travel, recovered more slowly from physical exertion. But each morning he found strength to continue. Morrison's words echoed in his mind repeatedly. The mountain is not cruel, it simply is. Learn to live within it, respect it, and it will provide a way forward. By the evening of the 3rd day of travel, Marcus could see evidence that civilization existed beyond these mountains. Smoke rose from a distant valley, a thin column that stood out against the gray-blue sky. Crystal Creek was close now, perhaps only 5 kilometers away. He was close enough to smell success, close enough to believe that he would make it. The 4th day of travel began with Marcus's body in open rebellion. His legs, which had carried him faithfully through nearly 30 kilometers of mountain terrain, now protested with every step. His feet were blistered despite all his precautions. His knees ached from the constant descent. His pack, which had seemed manageable on the first day, now felt like it weighed 50 kilograms rather than 8. But the mountain was no longer quite so hostile. The elevation had decreased significantly over his 3 days of travel, and the temperature had moderated to a more manageable -20 degrees. The snow beneath his feet was still snow, but it was thinner now, occasionally giving way to patches of exposed earth. The trees were becoming more frequent, smaller evergreens giving way to larger pines and aspen groves. Marcus rationed the last of his dried fish for breakfast, knowing that today was critical. Either he would reach Crystal Creek today, or he might run out of food supplies before completing his journey. But more importantly, he was running out of physical capacity. His body was deteriorating faster than he could feed and rest it. The canyon walls seemed to close in around him as he descended further, following the stream that Morrison had identified in his journals. The water flowed more vigorously now, no longer blocked by ice. He could hear it more than see it in many places, rushing through channels beneath snow and vegetation. By late morning, Marcus heard something that stopped him dead in his tracks, the sound of a dog barking. A domestic dog, a sound of human civilization that seemed almost impossible after weeks of isolation in the mountains, nearly surreal in its ordinariness. His heart began to race. He pushed forward despite his exhaustion, moving as quickly as his failing body would allow. He rounded a bend in the canyon and saw it, smoke rising from chimneys, actual buildings with windows and evidence of human habitation. Crystal Creek. The town was real, not a figment of his imagination or Morrison's old journals, but actually present. Marcus tried to run and immediately realized his body was no longer capable of such exertion. After 3 days of intense physical effort, his muscles simply refused to respond with speed. Instead, he walked as quickly as his exhausted legs could manage, limping slightly from the blisters that had formed despite all his precautions. The first person he encountered was a man in his 60s, working on the fence surrounding what appeared to be a small ranch. The man looked up from his work, and his expression shifted from casual indifference to shock. He was wearing a thick coat, despite the relatively mild weather, and he had the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the mountains. Jesus Christ! the rancher said, setting down his tools. "Where the hell did you come from?" Marcus tried to speak and discovered his voice had become unfamiliar, rough from disuse and the dry mountain air, hoarse from weeks of silence. "Cabin," he managed. "Mountain. Blizzard." The rancher's expression shifted to understanding, then urgency. He set down his fence tools and gestured for Marcus to follow him toward the ranch house. "Come on inside, get warm. My wife will get you some food." Within minutes, Marcus was inside a warm house, genuinely warm, warmer than he'd felt in months, being given hot soup by the rancher's wife. Her name was Patricia, and she fussed over Marcus with the concern of someone who understood mountain dangers intimately. "How long were you in that cabin?" Patricia asked, ladling more soup into his bowl despite his protests that he was full. "2 weeks," Marcus said, then reconsidered. "Maybe 3. I lost track of days." Patricia and her husband, whose name was Dale, exchanged looks of grave concern. Dale said, "I should call emergency services. Search and rescue needs to know about you." "Please," Patricia added, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You look like you've been through hell." Marcus nodded, too exhausted to argue. Within minutes, Dale had called the sheriff's office, and within 30 minutes, there were people asking him questions. Marcus described the cabin, Morrison's journals, his journey out of the mountains. He tried to convey the significance of what he'd found, how Morrison's knowledge had saved his life, but the officials seemed focused primarily on ensuring he received medical attention. "You're severely dehydrated," one of the paramedics said, examining him, "and malnourished. We need to get you to a hospital for observation." The rescue helicopter arrived within 2 hours. As it ascended above Crystal Creek, Marcus looked down at the mountains he'd just crossed, the valleys and peaks that had been both his prison and his salvation. He thought about the cabin, now empty and quiet, with Morrison's journals still protected in the loft. He thought about the stream where he'd caught his first fish, the grove of twisted pines where he'd sought shelter, the landmarks that Morrison had documented decades ago. He thought about the journey that had transformed him from a desperate, terrified man into someone capable of reading the mountains' language and surviving within their embrace. The hospital in Billings, Montana, was a shock to Marcus's system despite its comfort. After weeks of isolation, the presence of so many people, so much noise, so much artificial light, was almost overwhelming. The doctors and nurses seemed genuinely impressed by his physical condition, given what he'd endured. "You're incredibly lucky," one doctor told him. "Severely malnourished, yes, but no frostbite, no signs of severe hypothermia. You clearly knew what you were doing out there." Marcus spent 2 weeks recovering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and the lingering effects of extended cold exposure. The hospital in Billings, Montana, was a shock to Marcus's system despite its comfort. After weeks of isolation, the presence of so many people, so much noise, so much artificial light was almost overwhelming. The doctors and nurses seemed genuinely impressed by his physical condition, given what he'd endured. "You're incredibly lucky," one doctor told him. "Severely malnourished, yes, but no frostbite, no signs of severe hypothermia. You clearly knew what you were doing out there." Marcus spent 2 weeks recovering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and the lingering effects of extended cold exposure. He underwent blood tests, CT scans, and psychological evaluations. The psychologist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, seemed particularly interested in his mental state. "Most people who experience what you experienced show signs of trauma," she explained during one of their sessions. "Nightmares, anxiety, difficulty readjusting to normal life. But you seem almost peaceful about it." Marcus thought about how to explain it. How could he describe what it felt like to have your entire perspective on life fundamentally altered? How could he convey that what seemed like a disaster had actually been a gift? "I was terrified at first," he told Dr. Chen. "When I realized I was trapped in that cabin during the blizzard, I thought I was going to die. But then I found something that changed everything." He spent that entire session describing Morrison's journals, explaining how a man he'd never met had left behind 40 years of accumulated wisdom, specifically at the moment when Marcus needed it most. He talked about learning to fish, about understanding the mountain's patterns, about the profound peace he'd experienced when he'd stopped fighting against his circumstances and instead learned to work within them. Dr. Chen listened carefully, taking notes. When he finished, she smiled. "That's actually quite healthy," she said. "You've processed this experience in a constructive way. You haven't denied the danger or minimized it, but you've also extracted meaning from it. That's actually ideal psychological recovery from trauma." By the time Marcus was discharged from the hospital, he'd made a decision. He would go public with Morrison's story. The journals, he believed, represented something far more valuable than his personal survival. They represented a complete philosophical and practical guide to mountain living that could help others. He contacted the Forest Service first. He explained who Morrison was, where the cabin was located, and provided them with detailed coordinates that he'd carefully recorded during his time at the cabin. He described the journals, their contents, and their potential value to mountain rescue organizations. The Forest Service responded with surprising enthusiasm. Within a week, officials had located the cabin and confirmed that Morrison's journals were indeed there, preserved in the loft, exactly as Marcus had left them. Within a month, the cabin had been registered as a historical landmark and placed under protection. Morrison's journals were carefully extracted and transported to a climate-controlled archive in Helena, Montana, where specialists began the process of preservation and cataloging. The discovery attracted media attention. Local news outlets picked up the story, then regional outlets, then national news networks. Mountain Man's Journal's Save Stranded Hiker became a headline that appeared in newspapers across the country. Marcus found himself being interviewed, his story told and retold, analyzed and discussed. But the most meaningful consequence came 6 weeks after his discharge from the hospital. Marcus received a letter from a woman named Eleanor Morrison, James Morrison's granddaughter. "Dear Mr. Webb," the letter began, "I cannot adequately express what finding my grandfather's journals has meant to my family. My grandfather left our family when I was very young. I barely remember him. But through his journals, I have come to know him as an adult. I have read his thoughts, his struggles, his discoveries. Your survival has given me the gift of knowing my grandfather's life work. Thank you for that extraordinary gift. My family would like to meet you if you are willing." Marcus agreed, and 3 weeks later, he found himself in Denver at Eleanor's home, surrounded by Morrison family members, all of whom had read the journals and felt connected to the man they'd thought they'd lost. Eleanor's son, Mark, was a photographer. He became passionate about documenting the cabin and Morrison's legacy. Together, Mark and Marcus arranged an expedition back to the cabin in early summer when the weather had stabilized. They brought supplies and equipment and spent 2 weeks photographing the cabin, filming interviews, and creating a documentary about Morrison's life and legacy. The documentary, released the following year on a streaming platform, became unexpectedly popular. Viewers were moved not just by Marcus's survival story, but by Morrison's philosophy of living in harmony with the natural world. The film sparked renewed interest in wilderness survival training and in the mountains themselves. Outdoor recreation companies began using Morrison's techniques in their training programs. Universities started researching and teaching his methods. But perhaps most importantly, the film inspired others to document their own knowledge and pass it forward. Experienced mountaineers, wilderness guides, and outdoor enthusiasts began creating their own journals, their own guides, recognizing that knowledge passed down directly from person to person was invaluable. Marcus returned to his career as a geologist, but with a fundamental transformation in his perspective. He began leading wilderness safety seminars, always beginning with the same story: The story of how a man dead for nearly 40 years had saved his life through the simple act of documenting knowledge. He became an advocate for preserving wilderness knowledge, for teaching practical skills alongside academic learning, for understanding that survival was as much about mindset and preparation as it was about luck. One of his most successful seminars was titled Reading the Mountain, Learning from James Morrison. In it, Marcus taught participants how to observe landscapes, how to extract information from natural patterns, how to approach wilderness challenges with systematic thinking rather than panic. Morrison taught me something that transformed my understanding of survival, Marcus would tell participants. He taught me that the wilderness isn't trying to kill you. It's simply indifferent to your survival. Your job isn't to fight it or fear it. Your job is to understand it and work within its parameters. That's not just good advice for mountains. That's good advice for life. The cabin still stands, maintained now by the Forest Service with funding from the Morrison family. Inside, on a shelf near the fireplace, Morrison's original journals sit behind protective glass. A plaque on the wall describes Morrison's life and legacy, and explains how his journals saved a man's life nearly 40 years after his departure from the cabin. And sometimes, when hikers are caught in unexpected storms in the Beartooth Mountains, they find shelter in that cabin. They read the story of James Morrison and Marcus Webb, and they understand that they, too, are part of a legacy of human knowledge, passed down through generations, connecting strangers across time. Marcus visits the cabin twice a year now. He brings supplies, he maintains Morrison's memory, and he sits before the same fireplace where Morrison once sat, where he himself sat during those critical weeks. In the quiet moments, staring into the flames, he thinks about the remarkable chain of circumstances that brought him to this place. A blizzard that seemed like death but became life. A cabin that seemed like a prison but became a university. A man he'd never met who became his greatest teacher. Years later, when interviewing for a documentary about survival stories, Marcus was asked, "Do you think you would have survived without Morrison's journals?" He considered the question carefully. "I honestly don't know," he said finally. "Physically, maybe. I had some training, some equipment, but mentally, emotionally, I don't think so. Morrison's journals gave me more than practical knowledge. They gave me hope. They gave me proof that someone had stood in that exact place, faced those exact challenges, and not just survived, but thrived. They proved that the mountain wasn't my enemy, it was my teacher. That changed everything." Eleanor Morrison, now elderly herself, decided to create a foundation in her grandfather's name, the James H. Morrison Foundation funded wilderness education programs, supported the preservation of historical survival knowledge, and provided grants to researchers studying human resilience and adaptation. "My grandfather spent 40 years in those mountains learning how to live," Eleanor would say when speaking about the foundation. "Marcus spent 3 weeks learning from him. Now, we're giving thousands of people the opportunity to learn from both of them. That's the power of knowledge preserved and passed forward." The story of Marcus Webb and James Morrison became a parable about the importance of documentation, about the value of passing knowledge forward, about the interconnection between generations, even across decades of time and distance. Universities began teaching it in environmental studies programs. Mountain rescue organizations incorporated Morrison's techniques into their training. Adventure travel companies referenced the story in their marketing. But for Marcus, the most meaningful outcome was simpler. He had faced death and found life. He had been terrified and discovered courage. He had been lost and learned to read the landscape. And most importantly, he had learned that survival wasn't about individual heroism. It was about connection to something larger than yourself, whether that was nature or human knowledge, or the accumulated wisdom of generations. On the anniversary of his rescue every year, Marcus would return to the hospital in Billings and thank the people who had helped him. He would visit Crystal Creek and thank Dale and Patricia for their kindness. And he would visit the cabin and sit in silence before the fireplace, grateful for the blizzard that had changed his life, grateful for Morrison's legacy, grateful for the mountain that had taught him how to live. The cabin became more than a historical landmark. It became a shrine to human resilience, a testament to the power of knowledge preservation, and a physical manifestation of the idea that we are never truly alone. We are always connected to the people who came before us, the people who will come after us, and the natural world that sustains us all. Marcus Webb had entered those mountains as a lost man searching for meaning. He emerged transformed, carrying with him the lessons of a stranger, prepared to pass them forward to a world that desperately needed to remember how to listen to the mountains, how to respect the wilderness, and how to survive not just through technology and fear, but through knowledge, observation, and respect for the natural world. And in a cabin in the Beartooth Mountains, protected behind glass, Morrison's journals continue to speak to visitors, continuing the conversation that began in 1954 and was renewed in 2024. A conversation that will continue as long as there are people who venture into wild places and seek to understand them. Thank you so much for staying with this incredible story to the end. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next amazing survival story. Your support means everything to me and helps bring more of these powerful stories to your screen. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.